So the whole of this book, The Art of Being Ruled, is basically him talking about like the will to power and the way that equality is unnatural. He has a couple of choice quotes. I'll give you some choice quotes from the rest of the book, which will give you a bit of a flavour. So he says 90% of men long at all times for a leader. They are on the lookout, whether they know it or not, for someone who will take all responsibility off their shoulders and tell them what to do.
Carlylean sentiment.
Yes, he does.
Very much so.
And also, he's a big fan of Sorel. Now, the reason he likes Sorel is because he likes syndicalism because it locks people into their profession. There's none of this sort of social mobility stuff, none of this democracy nonsense. You are locked into your profession. You are the John Smith black.
Yes, I as you can imagine, I've been considering these sorts of ideas myself. I haven't read any actual syndicalism, but I've been looking at guilds and thinking about, ways of actually just locking people into, this area over here. You'll be the bricklayers, and these people will be like the brewers or whatever, to build up, like, I don't know, a tradition of whatever that thing is, and master apprentice systems. You can kind of see the attraction from a kind of post-liberal point of view.
Yeah, I mean, he's interested in syndicalism because it's both radical and also extremely reactionary.
When I first listened to this stream by Academic Agent, I can honestly say that I would have thought syndicalism was merely a synonym for unionism. Well, not so. And what I'm going to do today is try to get some of my thoughts down. And excuse me for some of the background sounds. There's just no way to find a quiet time around here. So I'm just going to get some ideas down here, and like I say, excuse the background noise if you hear anything. So let's just talk a little bit what I have noted now on syndicalism. It is better to think of this, I think, as another movement reacting to liberalism and specifically capitalism. And this is very relevant in our times as it becomes increasingly clear what liberalism is, what a liberal society is, and what its methodology is. It is to create conflict or perpetuate it, and not to resolve it. In the 19th century, political conflict was understood almost entirely in economic terms, a class struggle. The bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the capitalist against the worker. But in our time, perhaps very recent times, the liberal state identifies and creates conflict not only between classes, but also genders, religions, cultures, races, and most prominent today is the politicization of health status. The liberal state then creates draconian laws to fix the problem, which don't work. The draconian measures make the problem worse, make the conflicts worse, and the cycle continues. The liberal state never resolves any conflicts. The war on poverty in the 60s, the war on drugs, the war against racism, the war against anti-Semitism, homophobia, on and on. And we can expect the war on health status to never be resolved. So we can look back at syndicalism as one of these early attempts to end the perpetual conflict into which we continue to sink today. Nothing has worked so far to overthrow liberalism and its corrosive effect on society. Another try at correcting this perpetual conflict was the corporative state, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, a few notes I've jotted down on syndicalism. Syndicalism is current in the labor movement to establish local worker-based organizations and advance the demands and rights of workers through strikes. Most active in the early 20th century, syndicalism was prominent amongst the revolutionary left in the interwar era, which preceded the outbreak of World War II. Many scholars have applied the term syndicalism to a number of organizations or currents within the labor movement that did not identify as syndicalist. They applied the label at one time to big unionists or industrial unionists, and groups that identify as revolutionary industrialists, revolutionary unionists, anarcho-syndicalists, and on and on. Others give a more restrictive definition of syndicalism, and that's the one I'm referring to today. There are 5 criteria. 1, a preference for federalism over centralism, opposition to political parties, seeing the general strike as the supreme revolutionary weapon, favoring the replacement of the state by a federal economic organization of society. And 5, seeing unions as the basic building blocks of a post-capitalist society. In fact, it was anticipated by some of these syndicalists that worker organizations would replace rule by the state. So you can see it's an attempt to rebuild society and to end the perpetual conflict, at that time seen as class struggle primarily, so economic. One of the more famous writers in this area would be the philosopher George Sorel and his Reflections on Violence, which introduced syndicalism or syndicalist ideas to a broader audience. Sorel presented himself as the premier theorist of syndicalism and was frequently thought of as such, but he was not a part of the movement, and his influence on syndicalism was insignificant except in Italy and Poland, apparently. And I just want to refer here to a critique, syndicalism's critique of capitalism and the state. Bill Haywood, a leading figure in the IWW, defined the union's purpose at its founding Congress as the emancipation of the working class from the slave bondage of capitalism. Syndicalists held that society was divided into 2 great classes, the working class and the bourgeoisie. Their interests being irreconcilable, they must be in a constant state of class struggle. Tom Mann, a British syndicalist, declared that, and I quote, "the object of the unions is to wage the class war," end quote. This war, according to syndicalist doctrine, was aimed not just at gaining concessions, such as higher wages or a shorter working day, but at the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Syndicalists agreed with Karl Marx, characterization of the state as the executive committee of the ruling class. They held that a society's economic order determined its political order, and concluded that the former could not be overthrown by changes to the latter. Syndicalists advocated direct action, including working to rule, passive resistance, sabotage, and strikes, particularly the general strike, as tactics in the class struggle as opposed to indirect action such as electoral politics. The final step towards revolution, according to syndicalists, would be a general strike. It would be, and I quote, "the curtain drop on a tired old scene of several centuries and the curtain raising on another," according to Griffules. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. That's Grifffuelhes. Syndicalists remained vague about the society they envisioned to replace capitalism, claiming that it was impossible to foresee in detail. Labor unions were seen as being the embryo of a new society, in addition to being the means of struggle within the old. Syndicalists generally agreed that in a free society, production would be managed by workers. The state apparatus would be replaced by the rule of workers' organizations. In such a society, individuals would be liberated, both in the economic sphere, but also in their private and social lives. Now, after World War I, from the early 1920s, the traditional syndicalist movement in most countries began to wane for various reasons. You do have the emergence of something called fascist syndicalism. In the early 20th century, nationalists and syndicalists were increasingly influencing each other in Italy. And this is where we get to the corporative state. And referring to Sorel again, after his death in 1922, syndicalist leader Agostino Lanzillo, now of the fascist movement, wrote in the Italian fascist review Gerarchia, which was edited by Mussolini, perhaps fascism may have the good fortune to fulfill a mission that is the implicit aspiration of the whole oeuvre of the master of syndicalism, to tear away the proletariat from the domination of the Socialist Party, to reconstitute it on the basis of spiritual liberty, and to animate it with the breath of creative violence. This would be the true revolution that would mold the forms of the Italy of tomorrow. Okay, which brings us to this concept, this idea called the corporative state, which came to a shattering end with World War II. But before that, how is it perceived? And I'm going to be reading from a book written in 1933. And this is called Economic Foundations of Italian Fascism by Paul Einzig. Chapter 3, the corporative state, or the corporate state. The term corporate state is almost unknown outside Italy. It conveys little or nothing to the man in the street in England, while even most economic experts and politicians have only hazy notions of its meaning. Volumes could be written about its political, social, and legal aspects. From a political point of view, it is a new type of constitutional system in which the employers and employed grouped into mixed national corporations play a predominant part in the government of the country. It is a new kind of democracy, as contrasted with the parliamentary democratic system from a social point of view. It entails the elimination or reconciliation of conflicts between various classes of the population. From a legal point of view, it implies a new conception of the rights and duties of individuals within the state, and a modified conception of the limitations on the use of property and productive factors. All this is beyond the scope of the present book, which is confined to the examination of the economic aspects of corporate state. Before everything else, it is necessary to rule out certain erroneous notions that have gained ground abroad about the corporate state. It is not identical with a dictatorship of the right, as contrasted with communist dictatorship of the left. In fact, it need not necessarily be based upon dictatorship. It is true that in Italy, dictatorship existed before the foundations of the corporate state were laid by the Carta del Lavoro, labor charter. This was, however, the result of circumstances. Dictatorship as it has existed in Italy during the last 10 years is only a transition period. I guess you could call it that. The trend of evolution is towards the creation of a new democracy as a permanent basis of the corporate state. Already the heavy hand of dictatorship is used much less than in the earlier stages, and a time will come when the use of the dictatorial power of the head of the government will be a rare exception. Corporate state is not identical with planned economic system. It is possible to conceive such a system on a different basis, although the corporate state provides an ideal basis for it. Conversely, it is possible to conceive of a corporate state without the application of a planned system of production and distribution. In fact, most authors describing the system pay very little attention to its relation to economic planning. They see in the corporate state merely an instrument for establishing industrial peace. Regarded from the point of view of its historic evolution, they are undoubtedly right, for before it could be used for any other purpose, the corporate state had to undertake to secure industrial peace. Now turning over to I was reading from chapter 3, pages, there's no pages, 32, 33, 34. It may be asked how it is that, although the fascist regime has been in existence in Italy for over 10 years, it has not yet reached the stage of developing the corporate state to its logical conclusion by the establishment of a planned economic system. The answer is that Rome was not built in a day. In fact, this Rome was going to come to a crashing end very soon. It took communism in Russia 10 years before it could settle down to economic planning on scientific lines by means of the 5 years plan, and yet the theoretical basis of the system existed long before 1917, and the present leaders had ample opportunity to study it and consider it during their long years of exile or imprisonment. Although fascism has not entered the practical field without theoretical foundations, in 1922 there existed no cut-and-dried system ready to experiment with. Even today, after 10 years of fascist rule, the ultimate aims of the system are far from clear. In these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that the progress towards planned economy is slow. The first step to that end was the introduction of iron discipline in the economic system through the formation of national corporations. This was achieved through the development and expansion of the syndicates of employers and employees that had been created after the war. In 1926, the status of these syndicates was regularized by legislation. The basic ideas of the law of April 3, 1926 are: 1. The voluntary character of membership. 2. Official recognition as soon as a syndicate represents 10% of those engaged in the trade or profession. 3. The right and duty of the syndicates thus recognized to represent all non-members in the same trade or profession. 4. The interdiction of strikes and lockouts. And compulsory acceptance of the decision of labor courts for the settlement of disputes. It is not the object of the corporate state to suppress the identity of classes by merging them into mixed corporations. Within the framework of these corporations, the syndicates of employers and employees retain their respective identity. Each corporation, with the exception of that of the professional men and artists, consists of 2 national confederations, the one representing the employers' groups, and the other the employees. It is evident that without even consciously embarking upon the establishment of a planned economic system, the corporate state, by its mere normal functioning, contains the elements of a planned economy. It is contrary to the fundamental principle of laissez-faire to consider in economic activity any interest other than our own. According to the 19th century liberal school of thought, all that anybody in the course of his economic activity had to do was to endeavor to obtain for himself the maximum advantages at the minimum sacrifice. In private life, we may be generous and charitable, but in the sphere of our economic activity, we are supposed to be devoid of any public spirit. This school of thought firmly maintained that in looking after ourselves, we all unconsciously contributed to the welfare of mankind, an end that was supposed to be achieved by the automatic play of economic factors. The moment we begin to discuss the consequences of our actions upon others than those directly concerned, we depart from pure laissez-faire and enter the field of economic planning. It is, of course, a far cry from the subconscious planning implied in the elementary working of the corporate system to the deliberate adoption of scientific planning in the place of the unscientific anarchy that characterizes the system of laissez-faire. Nevertheless, it would be difficult to deny the existence of the elements of planning in a system in which economic activity is carried on with due regard to its repercussion upon other spheres of economic life. Once this principle has been adopted in the place of the 19th century slogan of everybody for himself, the progress towards conscious adoption of planning is inevitable. Even if the leaders of Italian fascism were to be opposed to the idea of a planned economic system, they would find it difficult to arrest the trend of evolution which they initiated through the organization of the corporate state. Conversely, planning would be difficult in a capitalist state unless the corporate system was adopted for its basis, in substance if not in actual form. Although politically the corporate state in Italy is based on dictatorship, economically it is based on an increasing degree of voluntary cooperation between the various economic interests. On the other hand, while the attempt to introduce economic planning in a country without the preliminary creation of a corporate system might be carried out on the basis of the existing system, the laws regulating economic activity would have to be imposed upon a grudging population. The enlightened government and Parliament would have to face the resistance of hostile economic interests, which might frustrate their efforts, at or any rate, would render their enforcement very difficult. Evidently, the first step towards planning is the creation of discipline and a spirit of cooperation in economic life. An alternative to planning imposed upon economic interests by governments and parliaments is planning decided upon and carried out by the economic interests themselves within their own respective spheres. There have been ample examples of such planning before, as well as after the war. Cartels and trusts have endeavored to regulate production nationally or internationally within their sphere. Agreements have been concluded between producers of the same kind of commodity to regulate output. All these agreements were characterized by the same egotistical attitude that characterized the policy of the trade unions. The producers aimed at obtaining the maximum advantage for themselves without considering the repercussions of their policy upon outside interests. Their endeavors towards cooperation and planning were confined to their particular branch of activity, and there was no concerted action between those branches to act in accordance with a general plan. Governments did not endeavor to coordinate these efforts towards planning. As a result, public interest was sacrificed, while very often, owing to their short-sighted selfishness, the producers themselves had in the long run to pay the price. It appears that planning in a capitalist state cannot be carried out successfully either by imposing it upon unwilling economic interests or by allowing those interests a free hand to devise their own schemes. It is only by combining the desire of economic interests to cooperate with the guidance of the central authority that planning can be made to succeed. Such combination exists in the corporate state, which is therefore eminently suited to be the medium for the introduction of economic planning. Pause there. One thing that is obvious from this writing is that this remains a purely economic vision. Another thing that seems obvious is this description of the corporate state could well be applied to the modern liberal system, except in the technocratic system, it's definitely with the dictatorship, as opposed to dictatorship being optional. They seem to go very well together under modern technocracy. But we are certainly living, it appears today, in a planned post-economic society where the public-private distinction does not exist. Government and corporations work together. If one is woke, both are woke. This world in 1933 that the author describes is a world where there seemed to be only one goal, which was to deal with the economic issue of class struggle. It was a world without wokeness, multiculturalism, globalism, and of course the technocratic management of our lives. But the corporate state, in response to liberalism, is obviously incomplete in other ways, especially today. I would say it is too optimistic. It is too legalistic and positivistic. Certainly, you could imagine the ideas of the corporate state being used to, say, protect a community from the central government. For example, a traditional Christian community could corporatize and have its Christian status protected from the incursions of the multicultural central government's policies or whatever. But again, you have the problem of relying on laws. Laws can be changed, laws can be ignored, as we know. And the fact that a law is made does not necessarily make it good, as this example will illustrate.
You'll observe that the charges are supported by an overwhelming body of testimony.
I can read, thank you. You've been uncommonly fortunate, I see, in deathbed confessions.
It's all perfectly legal, I assure you, sir.
So perhaps better not to rely solely on law or regulation. Perhaps better a good aristocracy than a good law. A legion of honor based on merit rather than regulations. Or better Bonaparte than Bonapartism. One idea I would like to explore further is how to deal with the passivity that technocracy has been so skillful in creating, and which makes measures to deal with this perpetual conflict almost impossible even to imagine. Not only is liberalism showing itself clearly to be the opposite of democracy, as Carl Schmitt writes in his The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, if democracy means mob rule or rule of the people, the mob or the people under this technocracy is increasingly powerless. Nothing seems to wake it up. No amount of abuse, and I'm certain no amount of legalism. It is as if the very idea of power and self-rule has vanished. Now, I mentioned Sorel, and I came upon this passage in Carl Schmitt's book I just referred to. He writes about the power of myth as central to Sorel's ideas. All right, he writes that Schmitt writes, Sorel's ideas have as their center a theory of myth that poses the starkest contradiction of absolute rationalism and its dictatorship. But at the same time, because it is a theory of direct active decision, it is an even more powerful contradiction to the relative rationalism of the whole complex that is grouped around conceptions such as balancing public discussion and parliamentarism. The ability to act and the capacity for heroism, all world historical activities reside, according to Sorel, in the power of myth. Examples of such myths are the Greeks' conception of fame, of a great name, the expectation of the last judgment in ancient Christianity, the belief in vertu and in revolutionary freedom during the French Revolution, and the national enthusiasm of the German War of Liberation in 1813. Only in myth can the criterion be found for deciding whether one nation or a social group has a historical mission and has reached its historical moment. Out of the depths of a genuine life instinct, not out of reason or pragmatism, springs the great enthusiasm, the great moral decision, and the great myth. In direct intuition, the enthusiastic mass creates a mythical image that pushes its energy forward and gives it the strength for martyrdom, as well as the courage to use force. Only in this way can a people or a class become the engine of world history. Wherever this is lacking, no social and political power can remain standing, and no mechanical apparatus can build a dam if a new storm of historical life has broken loose. Accordingly, it is all a matter of seeing correctly where this capacity for myth and this vital strength are really alive today. In a modern bourgeoisie which has collapsed into anxiety about money and property, in this social class morally ruined by skepticism, relativism, and parliamentarism, it is not to be found. The governmental form characteristic of this class, liberal democracy, is only a demagogic plutocracy. Who, then, is the vehicle of great myth today? Sorel attempted to prove that only the socialist masses of the industrial proletariat had a myth in which they believe, and this was the general strike. And here is Schmitt's critique of Sorel. If one may reply to an irrationalist theory as decisive as this one with argument, one must point out its numerous discrepancies, not its logical mistakes, but its inorganic contradictions. Above all, Sorel sought to retain the purely economic basis of the proletarian standpoint, and despite some disagreements, he clearly always began with Marx. The theory of myth is the most powerful symptom of the decline of the relative rationalism of parliamentary thought. If anarchist authors have discovered the importance of the mythical from an opposition to authority and unity, then they have also cooperated in establishing the foundation of another authority, however unwillingly, an authority based on the new feeling of order, discipline, and hierarchy. And what Schmidt points out is there is no more powerful myth than the myth of the nation, of nationalism. And you can see this played out very clearly in response to Barbarossa in Russia, where Soviet Russia became nationalist Russia and fought the Great Patriotic War. Or modern China today. Is modern China anything else but a nation driven by a national myth? All right then, 4 conclusions I can draw from this little stroll into syndicalism and beyond. First, all attempts to date to put out the destructive fire of liberalism have failed, obviously. Second point, legalism, regulation, corporatism, a corporate state, syndicalist ideology, nothing has succeeded to date. And certainly working within the system has failed. Third point, we need something else, something moral, a matter of character. And the final point, we need to unify the opposition, whatever that opposition may be, with a national myth.